Okay, there we are. So, all right. So our next guest was Colorado's 41st governor from 2007 through 2011. And during that time, Bill Ritter focused much of his efforts on promoting renewable energy and what he called the new energy economy. During his tenure, he signed 57 energy bills, including an aggressive 30% renewable energy standard. After his 4 years, he became the founder and director of the Center for the New Energy Economy, which is based right here in this building. Please join me in welcoming former Governor Bill Ritter.
Thank you.
All right. So, Governor, I think one of our challenges in this conversation will be not to just roll annoyingly off the stage. But, I wanted to start things off this evening by having you tell us a little bit about and explain the concept of the new energy economy and why you call it that versus, say, something like the green energy economy.
Well, first of all, because we think we were, at the time when we really began talking about it, that we were doing something completely different for the state of Colorado. There was a bit of a pejorative connotation with green. Environmental groups that had tried to shut down development in different places around, particularly the mountains, began to be known as green groups. And we were really trying to understand how to bridge political chasms, how to bridge ideological divides, and try and get Coloradans to a place where they understood you could produce energy domestically. And while we did a lot on renewable energy, we were also trying to understand the role of natural gas, quite frankly, the role of coal, the role of all forms of energy. But you could produce energy domestically. You could do it in a way where there was an economic benefit to it. We really believed as well that you could address environmental concerns if you paid attention to it. And then finally, that you could do it in a way where you provided equity for ratepayers. Now, you'll notice those are 4 E's. And we began, even in the campaign before I became governor, talking about the new energy economy with this mnemonic device that was about energy, environment, economic development, and equity. And there are a lot of people saying you can't have it all. You can't get all of those things at the same place. And we actually used a value lens when we looked at energy legislation. We used that value lens to say, does it do those things? So when we put into place a 30% renewable energy standard, we knew that would have tremendous environmental benefits, but we also believed we could do economic development. We could create jobs as a part of that. And so my director of the Governor's Energy Office, who now works with me at the center, Tom Plant, and he's here, Tom and our economic development director traveled together. And they worked in tandem to do energy work, but also to do economic development. And then we put rate caps in place to protect ratepayers. We wound up several years later being able to say that value lens worked. And so that's the new energy economy, was to think about it in terms of addressing multiple challenges at the same time.
Now, and a lot of what you do in your work is looking at the state level. If we look at the federal level and with Congress and we talk about significant energy policy, a lot of times we're talking about nothing as far as political gridlock and stalemates. But where there is that inaction on the federal side, there's this vacuum created that you're saying that the states are filling in some respect.
Yeah, that was the premise in part for coming to CSU and working with states, is that things were so shut down federally. There's a book that these 2 authors have written. One's a conservative and one's a progressive, and it's called It's Even Worse Than It Looks. And it's about the United States Congress. I've now testified twice in the last few years in front of the Senate Committee for Environment and Public Works, and I'm writing the sequel that's called It's Even Worse Than It's Even Worse Than It Looks. I mean, there is nothing happening at a comprehensive way in the United States Congress, and it's really a sad fact. The rest of the world actually looks at the Congress and believes all of America's shut down. And yet we have 220 million Americans who live in a state with a renewable energy standard, about 240 million Americans who live in a state with an energy efficiency resource standard. We work on energy policy at the state level, and actually we started tracking legislation that is introduced at the state level. 2 years ago, 4,500 bills were introduced at the state level around the 50 states. 600 of them became law. Republican and Democratic governors alike are actually working on trying to understand how to advance the clean energy agenda. They may be doing it for different reasons. Some may believe more about climate change and others in the economic opportunity. But you look at governors in Nevada, Michigan, the governors, the governor in Florida, not Florida, Georgia, actually signed legislation concerning solar. Governor Perry in Texas, a very conservative Republican, signed legislation on what's called demand-side management. There are Republicans and Democrats, as I said, at the state level that are working on this.
Yeah, but that you certainly can find numerous governors who are working against what you would declare to be your new energy economy.
Well, I'll tell you, that's also pretty interesting. And having been a governor, I can say this. The governors may say one thing, and then their people do something else. And so we actually are working with 13 Western governors on the president's Clean Power Plan. And there's very much a conversation happening sort of at the political level where people are saying, we don't like the EPA, we're going to sue the EPA. We are not happy with the Clean Power Plan. But when we convene all the energy and environment leads from those 13 states, they're saying, we actually think there's a way to do this. And if we're forced to do it by the EPA, we'll get to implementation. And here are some of the things we want you to think about in getting there. So it's not, if you're hearing only that, the Republican governors are opposed to this, there may be some of that happening, and as I said, from sort of the bully pulpit, but there are people in states working on trying to understand how to advance the clean energy agenda. The governor of Wyoming is a very conservative Republican. He's a friend of mine, and I consider him a friend. He said last summer, listen, I'm not a person who's been out there trying to clean up coal, and coal is a big thing in Wyoming, but he said, the markets are telling me I'm wrong about Wyoming's future. And so we need to recreate a different future for Wyoming than a coal future, than only a coal economy, because the stock market is actually telling me I need to do that. And those are the kinds of things that are happening, Dan, that some of them are driven by markets, some of them are driven by economic opportunity, and certainly there's among both Democrat and Republican governors, there are those who are looking at this and believing that climate change is real and it's impacting their state in a very serious way.
Still, even though if they are saying if the power plan is implemented, we will adapt, at the same time you still have governors like Mr. Meade who are saying that they will sue, or they are suing over this Clean Power Plan. And the governors of these coal states, they do say that this is, a fundamental piece of their economy, and that they will have to completely reshape how their economy runs if coal is removed as this major linchpin of what they do.
So they did set aside $2 million in Wyoming to sue the EPA over the Clean Power Plan. They're absolutely going to do that. The EPA has been winning lawsuits in front of the Supreme Court. They're used to getting sued. They get sued by both sides, the environmental side and the industry side. Everybody expects that there will be lawsuits. There's actually oral arguments on Thursday being heard in Washington, D.C. around a Clean Power Plan lawsuit, the first big lawsuit that's going to be heard by a 3-judge panel. So yeah, that's happening. But I'll tell you, and maybe Matt Meade is not the best example. Governor Snyder in Michigan is a pretty conservative Republican who's looking at it and saying, okay, we're importing 100% of our coal. We produce no coal here, so we're bringing that in from other states. It's about 70% of our entire portfolio. The 2 utility CEOs are telling me I should never build another coal plant in Michigan, so what are my options? He's creating, as a Republican, a clean energy plan that looks at renewable energy and natural gas production. And so it's domestic energy, right? And it also will address a variety of economic and environmental challenges. And they're paying more money for coal-fired generation than they would be paying if they imported wind power from Iowa. The governor of Iowa is a Republican. He knows it, so he's looking at it as at wind energy as an economic opportunity for him. The governor of Kansas is every bit as conservative as Matt Meade is in Kansas, but they're now starting to export Kansas wind into the southeast, where they have a big bet on coal. And the governor of Kansas is, by and large, refused to take apart the renewable energy standard, even when conservative groups have proposed legislation in Kansas to do that. So I guess I'm seeing it as half full. You may be seeing sort of the half empty side. That's your reporter sort of bias, I suspect. And my, sort of my governor bias. I want it to work. I want this to work out okay. And so, yes, there is still this fight going on in this country. Congress experiences it in a far bigger place. But I think the governors who are closer to the ground, paying attention to their people, and watching what people think about not just climate change issues, but public health and environmental issues are actually being part of this clean energy transition.
Well, I wanted to touch on that a little bit. So as far as, I think in many ways, in many parts of the country, especially renewable power, is still kind of presented under the lens of being part of the partisan divide, and that oftentimes green energy is just instantly associated with the left. And you did mention some examples of that, against that. And I would use another example, say Cory Gardner's Senate campaign, where he has some campaign ads where he's standing in front of wind power. There are exceptions to that, but are there any inklings you see of the GOP being more willing to accept and grapple onto clean energy, or is this a debate that will continue to be partisan?
Yeah, and this isn't the best way to manage energy policy through tax credits, but the production tax credit had a lot of Republican support. It didn't make it, but it had a lot of Republican support. This is just how bizarre the United States Congress is. There was a bill called the Shaheen-Portman bill that was more about energy efficiency, and it had actually bipartisan majority support. So it had, Portman is a Republican from Ohio, had pretty good Republican support, but they were so afraid of riders that would come that involved the Keystone Pipeline that they never actually heard the bill, in spite of the fact that having bipartisan Republican support. So yeah, I think it's far less partisan than it was 2 or 3 years ago. There's more economic opportunity. One of the things that Tom and I and others have been working on is looking at the state of Nebraska. So Nebraska has the fourth best wind in the country, out of any state in the country, and it only has 700 megawatts of wind installed. By comparison, that's less than about 25% of what we have in Colorado, with less good wind than they have in Nebraska. And so there now is a unicameral legislature up there, right? A lot of Republicans looking at how they make use of that. And one of the reasons they're doing it is they're looking south to Kansas, who's found economic opportunity in building wind, north to South Dakota, which has 20-some% of their entire grid is wind energy. Iowa is finding ways to export that into the Midwest market, and they're losing out on this economic opportunity by not doing wind. And so there are opportunities for solar. Texas is a very conservative state. You can shoot a cannon off, and many streets in Texas never hit a Democrat, right? And yet, having said that, you got to make energy policy funny at some point, right? You can't just allow it to remain staid. So in Texas, they're now understanding, well, we've got 11,000 megawatts of wind. They got more wind installed in Texas than any other state. We can do that for solar. How do we do that? And actually, it's policy, right? They need net metering, they need interconnection standards, and they need to understand what kind of an additional sort of incentive they can put in place. It doesn't have to be a lot because of the size of the resource, and they can build an industry there, and they're going to do it because in Texas, the thing they understand is economic opportunity.
Shifting gears a little bit. During your tenure, we have talked. You were such an ardent supporter of renewable energy and expanding the renewable energy economy here in the state. Your successor, Governor John Hickenlooper, he has also made energy a priority of his administration, but largely his priority has been oil and gas. I wonder, what are your reflections upon Governor Hickenlooper's take on energy? Do you find it misguided, or is he moving to a more practical energy economy to fit with the boom times?
So I really think the Colorado Rockies are actually going to have a better season than they had last year. I don't know. They didn't do much to trade in the off season, but one of the things, if you've been in public life, I started in public life in 1993, and about a third of the way to the question, you just say, well, this is one I don't have to answer. Here's the deal on this. We actually did promote natural gas. We started by rewriting the rules around oil and gas production because we as a state had not done what was necessary to try and really take into account the impact of hydraulic fracturing and the really big build-out that had happened, particularly on the western slope. We were the first state to modernize our rules. I give Governor Hickenlooper a lot of credit because they've added to the things that we did in 07 and 08 with 4 significant rules. And the last rule that they passed, the methane monitoring rule, really puts Colorado in a place, again, of being the toughest state in the country with respect to with oil and gas regulation. And the other thing we did was in 2010, under my administration, we had a Clean Air, Clean Jobs was the name of the act, but we took down 1 gigawatt of coal and replaced it with natural gas. I would have never done that had I not felt comfortable that we in Colorado had done a better job of regulating the industry than when I had taken office. Now, what I'll tell you is this is a moving target. It's evolving. The federal government just put in place rules for development of oil and gas on BLM land, and actually nobody was really happy about it. The environmentalist community said, not tough enough. The industry said, way too rigid. And that's the kind of battle that you have in public policy when you're trying to carve out sort of an energy agenda for the nation. So we made a lot of progress on renewables. We got to this 30% standard. Governor Hickenlooper doubled the standard for rural electrics, for rural electric co-ops, and I don't think he gets nearly enough credit for the fact that that was not only a fairly difficult thing to do, but there was some political liability in his election in 2014 that was part of the conversation in rural areas, is that he had doubled the renewable electric standard for rurals. The interesting thing about this, to just kind of go from because I think Governor Hickenlooper has a focus on energy, and I think that he's done some really good work, and there are things that you might do differently if I was still governor, or that he would have done differently. But the fact of the matter is you build on what other people have done. So he didn't have to do a 30% standard, and he did sort of the thing that was necessary. What we should pay attention to is what the naysayers said about a renewable energy standard in 2004, before I was governor, when the people of Colorado passed one, in 2007 when we passed the 20%, in 2010 when we passed the 30%. The naysayers said it would be too expensive. They said you couldn't get enough of it on the grid, you couldn't integrate it on the grid, and that quite frankly there's no way this 2% cap was going to work. I mean, all of those things, and none of them turned out to be true. None of them. So we as a state now, there are days when Xcel puts almost 60% of the power that they deliver to customers is wind energy. And they integrate that largely with natural gas. They still have a coal fleet, but they integrate that wind with gas because it's easier to do in terms of bringing the wind up and down. And it still has an intermittency. It's 3-cent purchase agreements, power purchase agreements that we're watching. Those were 9 cents in 2006, and they've been cut in a third. There's still a production tax credit. So the real cost of that's probably about 5-cent wind, which is cheaper than coal. And it's no carbon. And so ratepayers have not only not been harmed by it, they've actually they're better off as a result of it. And the reduction in emissions, Xcel Energy, if you look at their 2005 emissions and their 2020 emissions, it's a reduction of 35%, probably the best of any utility in America in terms of that 15-year span. And so we go back to it and say, who's holding the naysayers accountable for, kind of pushing back on this stuff? And there's still an effort to undo renewable energy standards in America. The Texas Senate did just actually vote to undo their renewable energy standards, so I probably shouldn't be too proud of Texas. But the fact of the matter is, we got to hold these naysayers accountable, because what they predicted to be the case when we did some fairly bold things in Colorado turned out not to be true.
I guess that was an answer. Now, you are on record as supporting natural gas as a part of the new energy economy, provided it's done responsibly. Yet, of course, hydraulic fracturing is a major controversial issue in this state, more of a hot-button energy issue than anything else. How do you make the environmental argument for hydraulic fracturing?
Well, I think the environmental argument involves a lot of pieces, and you have to parse it out. I'm a supporter of natural gas if the industry is regulated in a very serious way so that you can account for the environmental impacts, and if there's this culture of compliance inside the industry, and finally if there's strong enforcement. If those things are missing, then I think you have to ask the question, okay, then what are the environmental impacts absent strong regulations or absent strong enforcement, and really do a cost accounting for those issues. Air and air quality is certainly one of those things, and Colorado was the first state to pass capture rules, methane capture rules. The EPA has actually passed their own rules, and when they passed that rule, it was 3 years after Colorado's rules took effect, and Colorado operators had to do nothing new to comply with the EPA because of what we'd already put in place in 2009. As I said, Governor Hickenlooper did even more than that by requiring more significant monitoring. And that monitoring, I think, helps operators understand how much methane may be leaking and then really have to be held accountable for that. So that's the air side. That's not the only air side. There's volatile organic compounds that are a part of the mix when you have oil and gas operations. There's carbon dioxide just from the emissions, the vehicle emissions that are a part of it. And so places like Pinedale, Wyoming, the population of Pinedale is smaller than the number of people in this room, and they were in a non-compliance order from the EPA because of all the oil and gas development that was happening and what happened to their air quality as a result of it. So that's important for operators to understand. There's an air impact beyond just the possibility of methane leakage. The water aquifers is a big impact. Interestingly, a lot of people will say, and they're pretty close to being true when they say there's never been a hydraulic fracturing incident that's implicated the aquifer. It's probably not altogether true, but the fact of the matter is that's not the big issue. We're involved in a project with Dr. Ken Carlson here at CSU that looks at aquifers in a 24/7 way, and we can talk about that if you want to. But what we do know is that managing water, processed water, and fracking fluid when it comes back out of the ground is actually the biggest issue we have in this state. And not just in this state, across the United States. And so there's a lot of ways to implicate water quality if you're not managing it well when it comes out of the ground. There's ways to implicate the seismic activity underground if you're injecting it in deep well injections where there are significant faults, or maybe not significant faults, but faults that are underground. You can actually cause seismic activity. So there's a lot of parts to this equation that have to do with things other than just, is the aquifer safe when you're taking the fracking fluid in and bringing it back out.
Finally, Governor, the U.S. up until 2008 was the leader in renewable energy technologies and renewable energy investment. And last I looked, we are now sitting at number 3 behind both China and Germany. Have we lost our edge when it comes to renewable energy? And if not, what bright spots do you see? Well,
first of all, I think on the technology side, most of what's still happening with respect to technical innovations in renewables comes out of the United States. So I don't think we've lost our technological edge, our innovation edge, but we certainly lost the manufacturing edge to China where panels were concerned. And I went to China while I was governor. I've been back to China twice with CSU. You can stand on the edge of a panel manufacturing process in China. You can stand on one edge of it and not see the other end of it. It's so big. And largely these are state-owned enterprises as well, or the early ones were state-owned enterprises, and there was definitely some subsidies that were happening. And it's the reason there was a trade case that the United States filed against China over the panels. Now, they are producing panels in such a cheap fashion that we in the United States cannot manufacture panels and keep up. We just can't. So we've lost the manufacturing war, but I would argue that the things that are happening in terms of technological innovations, efficiencies around panels themselves, and even thin film photovoltaic, those are still spaces that are owned by U.S. and U.S. manufacturers. On wind, we probably are doing as much as other manufacturers, but the world's biggest manufacturer is Vestas, and it's producing panels in Colorado, 4 different plants, but their technology web is in Denmark. So they're probably doing as much as other companies around the world, including GE in the United States, Clipper Wind in the United States. So we have wind companies, but that's kind of a push, I think. I wouldn't think that you could say any one company has had the biggest advances as it relates to wind technology. On storage technology, the United States is going to figure that out. We're going to sort of win that battle on storage technology because of the number of really significant players are still working on that, and what a different storage technology will be in taking away intermittency with respect to solar particularly.
And rumor is Tesla is going to make a big announcement on storage here in the next month, here at the end of the month.
We have some cool things happening here at CSU on storage that could wind up, if it works well for the people who are the creators or the inventors, being breakthrough technology as well.
Great. All right, Director of the Center for the New Energy Economy, Bill Ritter.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Appreciate it.